The animation won't be ready for our next Skype session because I want to add music, and that's another editing process in itself. But this is the first step in achieving the animations and the prints. I was hoping I would have a print done for our next Skype visit, but this is quite time consuming, and sometimes when I take out an image, I'll just add some keyframes in here. And I cut the images, and I can move things around then if I'm not happy with the positioning here, in order to achieve the aesthetic that I'm looking for. And right now I'm playing this to music because I love to work with music as well, because it activates that plane in my mind that makes creativity happen. I begin with Photoshop, where I take images, merging images. This is something that I've started to do in just the last 6 months. Prior to that, I was more interested in looking at just color and setting mood and tone with just taking scenes, images of landscapes, of themes, perhaps beaches, boats. Now what I'm doing is I'm looking at color to set the tone, but I want to start merging ideas that show power, relationships. And so I begin in this one with the image of a beach and the plastic chair, lounge chair, and it's in a lagoon. It's very idyllic and rather lovely, and the colors are tranquil, and this is the life in the sun that people often aspire to and wish to attain. Now, juxtaposed with that is image of power, which happens to be the White House. And I think that this is very representational of sort of our ideal of reaching a place in the sun, and yet there are these external institutions and sources that perhaps change or redefine how the world exists and the frame in which it exists. Now, another image that takes the image of Washington, D.C., and here's the Lincoln Memorial and the obelisk, and then the Capitol Hill, but it's set now in a desert that is actually a photograph of a desert that's been created because of climate change. And so what I wish to sort of set up in this, or stage in this juxtaposition of photos, is a background that implies that these power institutions have altered our world and the environment in which we live, and impact it in ways that no one, I think, could have predicted. As I continued thinking about representing power sources and institutions of power, I thought of the colonialism that was part of Westminster's mandate at one point. And the Taj Mahal seemed like a representative of that colonialism. And while it may be that for us today, and this place of an ideal romantic love, it's a shrine or a mausoleum to Shah Jahan's third wife, it also, if you look then locally, what it represented was actually an institution, again, that of submission or of power that was in now the ruling class in India, and had taken over from sort of the Hindus, and he had come in from the north and set up this in Agra. Well, he didn't, it was his grandfather, King Akbar. So there were hundreds of years of sort of this colonialism, which the Taj Mahal actually represents, since it was built by an outsider who had come in and set up rule in India. So there are several levels of this power struggle going on, and then of course there's sort of a indirect reference, I guess, of the three wise men too. So it indirectly references again an institution of power, and which has become that, even though it wasn't meant to be that. And we'll touch on other things that I've been reading, and certainly with regard to Whitehead and even his concept of God, and the role that these ideas play in our concept structures. Now, within each of these backgrounds, then there are figures, and I'll begin with this figure of the car, and it seems like just a car on the surface, and yet it's not. This car is a Fisker. In my mind, from a design and artistic perspective, was far more aesthetically pleasing and had beautiful lines, and certainly much more so than the Tesla did, or does. And it was way ahead of its time in terms of its technology, its battery life, and the list goes on. It is a symbol of the rejection and ability to move away from the fossil fuel industry. It is the antithesis of power structures, because it was actually a form of freedom, which is how I view coming off the grid. Off the grid rejects fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are tied in with the oil industry, and the oil industry is the ultimate symbol of greed and all those negative qualities in mankind. So I juxtapose the car image with the image of dancers. Now, dancers for me, again, are the pinnacle of physical prowess, of mental discipline, and this is all wrapped up within a absolutely divine artistic form. So I like using them as representations of our ability to transcend. These are images of female ISIS fighters sitting on a BMW. And again, the BMW to me is a symbol of the wealthy class, the privileged, and also the fact that this in particular is a model that is not energy efficient or electric. It is based on fossil fuels, and part of ISIS's methodology was to take over oil fields so that they would have money to fund their terrorism. Now, in some of my reading, the interesting thing was that the male fighters were obvious. They were taken back, or when those captured were brought back to their home countries or countries of citizenship. They are now imprisoned. However, the capture of ISIS also brought to light another issue, and that is that of the women fighters. The women fighters were in a way something more unexpected, because there was a perception that ISIS had women just for breeding purposes. That was their only function. Now it's come to light that there are women fighters, and there are photographs that illustrate that they are at least holding guns, if not actually in the process of warfare. But what they've also done or discovered is that these female ISIS fighters and obviously radicalized, and they've radicalized their children, and there are large families involving 5, 6 or more children. And now the issue is what to do with these females and children who have been radicalized. Is it possible to de-radicalize them? And so I took that image, and again, in a situation which clearly views women as inferior to men. So there's one power structure there, but also because they're completely dressed in the niqab and expected then to hold guns and fight. And the question is asked, is this on equal terms then with the male ISIS fighters? And that's certainly what would be implied through this sort of an image, which really subverts this idea of the ISIS male power structure. I've juxtaposed that picture with this picture of, again, a ballerina for two reasons. Number one, that she's considered naked compared to the ISIS fighters, female fighters, and that, again, she epitomizes the beautiful things that females can create. The female dancer, clad in clothing that is in distinct contrast to the female ISIS fighters, and the fact that she's creating and not destroying, to me becomes a meaningful juxtaposition of images and represents the difficulty or the conflict in power structures I see happening in the world. Now the next set of images, I have a child who's sitting at a computer, or crouching at a computer. Now this image I took from a photograph of a child in a garbage heap somewhere in Africa, and he has no connection to Wi-Fi, the screen is blank, and yet he's so intensely focused on this desktop or laptop computer and working on it. And I thought that was a fantastic image, and I put it next to this image of the female violinist. I love, of course, music, and I'm involved in it, and I wish to explore its context within this idea folded time. And so I thought this image was very stirring when placed next to the child, because they both speak of creativity. One is immersed in his virtual world. In music, we find a transcendence of time and space when it is performed, because music is a very linear process with time measures and beats and bars, and it's extremely structured, and yet once it's performed, that structure is irrelevant. It's irrelevant to some degree. It has to be played properly, but I think that's what John Cage was getting at with his 433, because the sound itself was transporting, and the idea is that music can transcend space and time, that it can go in and out of these realities, and it's in the performance, in the listening, because it is intangible. And that's what this boy is accessing on his computer. Even though there's no Wi-Fi for him to be connected to, he's connecting to his virtual reality. And I saw them both as addressing the same issue of transcendence. And that's why I put them together. Now, in generating an image, I've discussed the background and how I come about, or my thought process in creating the layers. Now for the animation, this motion tween becomes very important. However, just the step before that is picking the stills, because the animations and the stills are linked, and so the story that I'm creating in this linear modality by moving images back and forth, this is the one that will eventually morph into the animation. But where I put these figures makes a difference in terms of the images I can produce. So I'm looking at this particular one, and it's interesting because of how the ballerina is dissolving and merging into the car with the fighters, but it's not quite got the aesthetic perhaps that I'm looking for in this particular instance. So I'm just traveling down and looking again to see what I might find as an interesting image. And here you can see little bits of the fighters. And I'm trying to sort out, there's the car, the Fisker I discussed earlier. And then the other form starting, I think of my male dancer coming up this way, yeah. But again, that's not quite what I'm after in this instant, especially with this background. Although when I look at it, I think that it is kind of interesting actually, because of these ISIS fighters here and their symbolic function, with the car linking this particular male dancer who actually has almost a threatening pose, which is sort of why I chose him, because his arm is outstretched and he's drawing the female dancer in, or in this instance it looks like he's drawing the car in. At any rate, he takes on this negative aspect, and the ballerina is just dissolving in here. And she's dissolving with the head of these ISIS fighters over there. And I think actually, now that I look at it, it does look kind of like a neat composition. So the other thing then would be how the size of the background, or the location of the background, works with these figures. Now the thing with Flash is that I can't move this particular image in any way against the background other than how it's already set up. So the only thing I can move is the background. And I can change its scale so that the images fill up more, and I can move its position so that I can put things in a way that perhaps clarifies the story or creates emotion and movement around the picture that will, or the eventual work that will be printed and then painted upon. And I'm looking at this one thinking that it's nearly done. I sort of like how it almost looks like he's kicking this chair or stepping on it, and in a way that seems to represent how he might be, how this image of a figure that's, if we look at negative balances and positive balances of power, he's certainly aligned with the negative balance of power, which I look at the White House and seeing that as a negative balance of power simply because I as an individual, or we as a society, don't really have much influence over that institution, which has a lot of influence not only within its own country but within the world stage. Therefore its significance in the negative realm becomes huge. That's how I see this male figure, whereas the female figure, perhaps hearkening back to the fact that females weren't viewed as strong, or perhaps it's just the fact that I chose this figure where she's not actively, it's more whimsical. This is frame 16, I'll just go back to this, where she's just sort of stretching out a leg, and she's not as active in her movements, and perhaps that's why that particular image, fragmented, works, because now she's linking these very active, implied active fighters, because they're actually just sitting on a car right now, gloating. So I like the way it transitions, and then the Fisker with its representation of power balances, and I'm thinking that when I add my ink drawings on top and the paint, that I could maybe work with this image, so I'll just export that. I've got a system of naming these things. I think this one's number 4, sorry. That's the one image that I've taken away. Now, I think it's important also to keep in mind that as I'm doing these things, I'm thinking, how is this going to look in terms of movement? Because, again, there's the static movement, or the movement of the static image within the static image, which I'm actually arguing is not a static image, that it is, by virtue of composition, coloring, layering, all the different elements being brought to it, that it actually is a very active image.